What is the moral meaning of money, of work, and of capitalism? Today we discuss Ayn Rand's answers to these questions. Welcome to the New Intellectual Book Study. I'm Cody Leibold. We are looking at the early character speeches in Ayn Rand's novel, Atlas Shrugged. This week, the speeches will be from Francisco d'Anconia and from Henry Reardon. Our goal is to understand Ayn Rand's view of the nature of a healthy society. In my version of the book, we are looking at pages 88 through 101. Through her characters, Ayn Rand challenges common assumptions in Western society and even in Christian thought. So let's head into the book. We start with The Meaning of Money, a speech by Francisco d'Anconia. A background on what Atlas Shrugged the book is. It was published in 1957. Its theme is the role of the mind in man's existence. And as a corollary, a demonstration of a new moral philosophy, the morality of rational self-interest. This would be the most famous and the masterpiece of Ayn Rand as a novelist. The story shows what happens to the world when the mind goes on strike, when the men of creative ability in every profession quit and disappear. This speech happens toward the beginning of the novel. This is a speech from Francisco, and he's speaking partly to a crowd of people at a party, but also partly to Henry Reardon, who he knows is in that crowd. Francisco d'Anconia is a copper industrialist. He is an heir to an enormous fortune, and he is John Galt's closest friend, and the first to join him in going on strike, if you're familiar with the overall idea of what happens in that novel. This is how the speech goes. "So you think that money is the root of evil," said Francisco d'Anconia. "Have you ever asked what is the root of money? Money is a tool of exchange, which can't exist unless there are goods produced and men able to produce them. Money is the material shape of the principle that men who wish to deal with one another must deal by trade and give value for value. Money is not the tool of the moochers who claim your product by tears, or of the looters who take it from you by force. Money is made possible only by the men who produce. Is this what you consider evil?" So he was in this discussion, kind of a ballroom discussion, and somebody had said that money was the root of all evil. Well, what is he responding to? He's responding to a common idea that floats around in Western civilization, and also a statement that we read from the Apostle Paul. A couple of Bible passages to get an idea of what is the correct understanding of this. First of all, let's look in 1 Timothy 6, verse 10. "For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evils. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pangs." So this is, of course, the place where this expression, "the love of money is the root of all kinds of evils," comes from. And within Christian preaching and Christian mainstream thought, sometimes this statement has transformed from "the love of money is the root of all kinds of evils" to simply "money is the root of all evil." That's the kind of thing that you might hear somebody say. Money is the root of all evil. Now, there are many things that we could debate as Christians about what it is that Paul is saying here, and we could compare what it is that Francisco is saying in his speech. And we'll do that as we go through on his speech. But the first point I want to make is that there is a big difference between money is the root of all evil, which is a Gnostic approach that says that life on earth and success on earth and anything that quantifies that, such as money, is evil because it's earthly, sort of a Platonist approach. There's a difference between that idea and what Paul is saying. So how would Paul line up with Francisco in the novel? And of course, what does Jesus teach? There's plenty of teaching about money in the Bible, and so we'll get to that. There will be several other verses that I'll bring in at some point, and I'll also mention John Piper, because John Piper has some interesting, controversial points about this issue. But before I do, anyone want to raise any questions or thoughts, interactions with the material so far?
I just want to point out, it's sort of silly. I just realized that the scripture is the root of all kinds of evil. And the part of stressing there is that it's all kinds of evil, as opposed to all evil. I consider myself someone who very closely reads the Bible, and I obviously knew that the distinction of it wasn't that money is the root of all evil. I knew that it was the love of money. But it's just now occurring to me the way you framed it. I was like, oh, yeah, all kinds of evil. It's not saying all evil.
There's also an S. All kinds of evils. It's not saying all of the kinds of evil that there are. It's saying many kinds of evils. That's the meaning.
It kind of makes it less of a bigger thing that people make it out to be.
Yes.
I did say that right, I think, but people make it out to be this huge deal, like, oh, it's money, like that's what all evil comes from. It's like, no, like actually read the words, and it's like lesser of a deal, lesser of a deal, lesser of a deal.
Yes. If you are already on this Platonist mindset that says that there's the things that are important and that matter, the things that are eternal, the things that are heavenly, and then there's life on earth, and life on earth is by definition not morally significant. Well, then you could easily see why people would try to take a verse like this and turn it into, yes, money, success on earth, prosperity, these are all things that are of no moral significance, which is the opposite of what Ayn Rand is trying to do in her philosophy. She's trying to create a philosophy for living on earth. If I go into that passage, what I'm seeing that Paul is warning about when he writes to Timothy is, how are you supposed to be teaching the doctrine? This whole section is about, okay, so some people are going to come in and they're going to teach different doctrines. Watch out. Some people are not going to be content with just preaching the truth that Paul has given, but they're going to try to change it for whatever reason. And then he goes on and he teaches about how you shouldn't have an unhealthy craving for controversy and for quarrels about the word, which produce envy. And so he's warning about some teachers that use this strategy of purposely deviating from Paul's teaching in order to get attention for themselves. But then he says, but godliness with contentment is great gain. We brought nothing into the world, and we cannot take anything out of the world. So he's encouraging Timothy and any other pastor or elder, consider the importance of the gospel here, compared to being able to get rich quick by changing it. Verse 8, he says, but if we have food and clothing, with these we will be content. Verse 9, but those who desire to be rich fall into temptation, into a snare, into many senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. And this is a common theme within Paul's letters. There were men who were aware of the gospel and who were using it to get rich. There were men who were trying to be competing against Paul in his ministry, and many of them began to love money more than they began to love the truth of the gospel. And then we get to verse 10, for the love of money is a root of all kinds of evils. So the context here is not, you should not desire money. That's not it at all. The context is, in ministry, the gospel must be your motivating power, not getting rich. And if you look today in the world, you see many pastors who try to build their own wealth, and it's always silly. You can always just see them a mile away because of how ostentatious they are in their displays of wealth. But this is a thing, isn't it? And Paul is warning against exactly this thing. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evils. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pangs. So he's not attacking self-interest. He's saying this is self-destructive. If you were to take that and rip it from its context, and you were to say that the love of money is the root of every evil that there is, or that money is the root of every evil that there is, then you would be putting yourself into the crosshairs of someone like Francisco, who is about to point out exactly why that's wrong. So let's find out. He says, when you accept money in payment for your effort, you do so only on the conviction that you will exchange it for the product of the effort of others. Skipping ahead, he says, your wallet is your statement of hope that somewhere in the world around you, there are men who will not default on that moral principle which is the root of money. Is this what you consider evil? So now he's taken this phrase and he's playing with it. He reminds me of Cyrano de Bergerac, and he's one of Ayn Rand's most colorful characters, one of my favorite characters. And I think that in this speech there's some humor because he keeps on going back to this one point. Is this what you consider evil? He's just ridiculing them, and it just comes so easy to him. So he points out, okay, so you want to say that money is the root of all evil? What's the root of money? That's actually the kind of wit that you see in much of Jesus' teaching, if you think about it. Jesus is a witty teacher, but what is the root of money? Well, it's productivity, of course. Production, but production is the external manifestation of human action. Internally, there's a virtue, and the virtue is productiveness. The desire to reshape the world, to be building value for yourself. Are you attacking virtue? That's what he's asking. When you consider money evil, are you considering productivity evil? He says, have you ever looked at the root of production? So what is the root of production now? Well, as we know from our previous interaction with Ayn Rand's material, it is man's mind that is the root of all of the goods produced and all of the wealth that has ever existed on earth. So if you're attacking money, you're attacking production, which means you're attacking productivity, which means you're attacking man's mind, which is the source of our values in this world, which means you're attacking man's life. He says, but you say that money is made by the strong at the expense of the weak? And then he says, wealth is the product of man's capacity to think. Skipping ahead, he says, money is made before it can be looted or mooched. Made by the effort of every honest man, each to the extent of his ability. An honest man is one who knows that he can't consume more than he has produced. So he's going to begin to tie this idea of creating wealth to all of the virtues that make man's life possible. He'll be talking about justice, about honesty, productivity, all these things. To trade by means of money is the code of the men of goodwill. Money rests on the axiom that every man is the owner of his mind and his effort. Now he's beginning to talk about justice. Money allows no power to prescribe the value of your effort except the voluntary choice of the man who is willing to trade you his effort in return. So he's talking about the trader principle, and by implication, he's talking about the need for people to deal with each other by their minds rather than by force, by persuasion rather than by guns, blood, and whips, which we'll get to. Top of page 90. Money permits you to obtain for your goods and your labor that which they are worth to the men who buy them, but no more. The principle of justice. Money permits no deals except those to mutual benefit by the unforced judgment of the traders. Again, pointing to the role of the mind. Money demands of you the recognition that men must work for their own benefit, not for their own injury, for their gain, not their loss. The principle of rational self-interest. The principle of independence, individualism. Egoism, personal interest, right? Skipping ahead, when men live by trade with reason, not force, as their final arbiter, it is the best product that wins, the best performance, the man of best judgment and of highest ability, and the degree of a man's productiveness is the degree of his reward. This is a true statement about how things work in the world. As a generalization, there can be exceptions, but you notice the socialists always want to discuss the exceptions. Generally speaking, the man who has a good product and makes it available to many people and shows them the value of it can become wealthy and can make the world a better place. Francisco says, this is the code of existence, whose tool and symbol is money. Is this what you consider evil? Having a code for existing in the world, for living on earth? He says, but money is only a tool. Now he begins to discuss the limitations of money. He says, money will not purchase happiness for the man who has no concept of what he wants. So now he's going to tie money to every part of human life. Let's tie it to happiness. Let's tie it to values. So money will not purchase happiness for the man who has no concept of what he wants. Money will not give him a code of values if he's evaded the knowledge of what to value, and it will not provide him with a purpose if he's evaded the choice of what to seek. Money will not buy intelligence for the fool. In the news this week, you may have noticed the collapse of FTX, and it looks like even just in the last several hours, it's been announced that someone hacked FTX and stole all the money from it. And this has been happening with cryptocurrency for months. It happened with Celsius. It's happened with BlockFi is affected, and whatever, all these other different ones, Voyager, and various crypto organizations. But it's not just crypto. In the last couple of years in the United States, a huge amount of inflation has happened because of the policies of our federal government and the Federal Reserve. All of these things tell us that there is a danger here. If you if you do not apply wisdom to how you interact with money. He says money will not buy intelligence for the fool. Rather, he says, the cheats and the frauds will come flocking to this fool that has money, drawn by a law which he has not discovered, that no man may be smaller than his money. So if you do not understand what money is, and if you do not treat it the way it should be treated, you're going to end up being a tool for the fraudsters. You'll be like a magnet to them, and this is absolutely true. I have a friend who is a financial advisor, and he talks to me about this, about how different people that he knows take their $500,000 or their $2 million or whatever that they have saved up when they're 60, and they put it in some scheme thinking that they'll get rich, and it all disappears. No man may be smaller than his money. Learn it now, or eventually you will learn it. Only the man who does not need it is fit to inherit wealth, the man who would make his own fortune no matter where he started. If an heir is equal to his money, it serves him. If not, it destroys him. One of the socialist critiques of our capitalist system is, why should people be able to inherit money? 91, he says, do not envy a worthless heir. His wealth is not yours, and you would have done no better with it. And he explains that. And he says, money is a living power. It dies without its roots. Money will not serve the mind that cannot match it. Is this the reason why you call it evil? So he's critiquing many of the different fallacies that have grown up around money. All right, any comments?
Yeah, I was going to say that this is part of one of the things that shows up in Opar. What Peacock gives as the central purpose of life is productive work. He said it's the only principle that you can organize your life hierarchically by. And I think this is the same principle showing up here.
Yes, I agree. Anything else you wanted to add about that? Anyone else?
One thing I want to say here, the way I'm sort of constructing this in my own mind, or at least one point of it, is that it seems like the people he's critiquing, at least some of them, they want money to serve them instead of recognizing that they need to serve money first. And what I mean by that is they need to earn it. They need to earn the money. And when you acknowledge that, you realize that to the degree that's true, you need to serve. Like, you need to work hard and earn it. But they just want to assume it and have it serve them. And they aren't facing that reality.
They're bitter.
And he's pointing that out to them.
They have this antagonistic relationship toward money because they don't understand it. And a lot of these people they're getting their money because they have political connections, or because they were appointed to some position, or because they're married to somebody who had a lot of money. And so they don't understand what causes money. They can't control it, and therefore they don't have a peace about what the money is and what it's for. And therefore they deride it. Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I think some of them, in this day and age, maybe they do understand what money is, and maybe that's why they hate it. The AOCs of the world who produce nothing, and so they're going to be angry at the Elon Musks in the world who are producing a lot.
Let's go on in the reading. Money, says Francisco, is your means of survival. The verdict that you pronounce on the source of your livelihood is the verdict you pronounce upon your life. If the source is corrupt, you have damned your own existence. That connects to the Platonist idea, or the Gnostic idea, separating your life from values, separating reality from values. Going on, he writes, this is skipping ahead, money will not give you the unearned, neither in matter nor in spirit. Is this the root of your hatred of money? And so there's some spiritual things in that section. People screaming that money will not give them self-respect, those kinds of things. Going on, or did you say that it's the love of money? And so he's aware, and Ayn Rand is aware of Scripture. Francisco says, or did you say that it's the love of money that's the root of all evil? To love a thing is to know and love its nature. To love money is to know and love the fact that money is the creation of the best power within you. So I put a question mark in my margin there. Wait, you're supposed to love money? Is that really what he advocates? Well, take him in context. He means loving a productive life that leads to the creation of wealth. And so the thing that he is advocating here is not the same thing as the thing that Paul is critiquing in the passage that we read in Timothy. Just not even the same thing. He is advocating that you should love productivity. Go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, I wanted to just say the next sentence that he says sort of affirms exactly your point there. It's the person who would sell his soul for a nickel who is loudest in proclaiming his hatred of money. And he has good reason to hate it. It's like you're saying, people fear what, hate and fear what they don't understand. And in that sense, that's the love of money that Paul is talking about. Kind of like when he says they'll be lovers of self, but they're going to destroy themselves. So how much do they really, truly love themselves? Some people take him at face value and say, oh yeah, they truly do love these things, with true love. Like, there's like as if there's no irony in the use of that term. And also, this reminds me of something that my pastor has said, which is the love of money that Paul talks about right there is not exclusive to people with a lot of money. It's very commonly found in people with very little money that have the sinful love of money, which is evident in many socialist and entitlement contexts.
That's well said. Okay, so let's go on. He says, let's see. He says, it's the person who would sell his soul for a nickel who is the loudest in proclaiming his hatred of money. And we know people like this. We've seen this. And he has good reason to hate it. Now, the lovers of money are willing to work for it. They know they are able to deserve it. That's the difference. Now he says, let me give you a tip on a clue to men's character. The man who damns money has obtained it dishonorably. The man who respects it has earned it. Within the Christian industry, we see a lot of love of money. And we see a lot of talking about how you shouldn't love money while saying, please donate a seed gift to my ministry, those kinds of things. It's so transparent. But now let's look at this next section. Run for your life from any man who tells you that money is evil. Now, is he talking about the Apostle Paul here? I don't think so. Maybe Rand would have thought that this applied to Paul, but not if you take Paul for what he's saying. The criticism does not apply. What about John Piper? Now, John Piper has an article, which I read several years back. It's from 2017. Piper says, is love of money really the root of all evils? This is at Desiring God. And Piper has a different opinion on this issue. He tries to take apart the translating of the passage, and he has a section here called Preserving Original Ambiguity. And so he wants to argue that, in some sense, all of our evils, all of our moral evils, do come back to a love of money. Now, I think he's making too broad of a claim here, but in some sense you can understand what he's trying to get at, which is that an improper prioritization of success on earth is usually connected to our evil motivations. True. But I don't think that all of our motivations go back to money. I think that many of them go back to the desire for prestige or convenience or different things that are somewhat peripherally connected to money, but not always. So I would say, Piper, you are in danger of being the kind of person, if you're not careful, that Francisco is talking about here. Run from your life from the man who calls money evil. Lately, I've been running for my life from John Piper and most of the ideas that I see from him. He needs to reject the woke trend. He needs to reject his passivism, and passivism even in the face of violence. He needs to get out of writing, or he needs to write more correctly. But let's go to page 92. Now he's going to say, if you don't use money, what's the alternative for organizing your life on earth? Their only substitute, if you abandon money, is the muzzle of a gun. Money demands of you the highest virtues, if you wish to make it or to keep it. Now, men who apologize for being rich will not remain rich for long. We see this with the altruists. All right, let's go on. Let's talk about the Attilas, those who take advantage of this cultural landscape in order to enrich themselves. You will see the rise of the men of the double standard, the men who live by force, yet count on those who live by trade to create the value of their looted money, the men who are the hitchhikers of virtue. When society establishes criminals by right and looters by law, men who use force to seize the wealth of disarmed victims, then money becomes its creator's avenger. Such looters believe it is safe to rob defenseless men once they have passed a law to disarm them, but their loot becomes the magnet for other looters. And this will happen in every welfare state. If one political party gets control of the state and turns it into a welfare state to enrich themselves, another party will come in and say, well, yeah, we can do it even better. We can enrich ourselves even more. And this will keep happening until the country is no longer able to sustain itself and it becomes weak. At which point, another country of the same mindset will look at it and say, oh, look, they're ripe for the picking. And that's how wars start. It's just looting and looting and looting. So then the race goes not to the ablest at production, but to the most ruthless at brutality. When force is the standard, the murderer wins over the pickpocket, and then that society vanishes in a spread of ruins and slaughter. That is the position of the United States today. One of the wealthiest nations in all of history, perhaps the wealthiest, and also at this time engaged in massive redistribution of wealth through looting and mooching. comments before I go to the next section?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of funny that you look at the parables of Jesus Christ, and we see over and over again, the idea of pursuing wealth, pursuing business, and making money being presented as a good thing. I believe it's Proverbs 31 where we have the ideal woman, and she's somebody who has a business and who takes care of the people of her household. She considers a field and buys it. So I think that people could take this one Bible verse that's being kind of vaguely alluded to by Ayn Rand, and they could take that out of the context of the rest of Scripture and do what Jacob's pointed out before, and do kind of like this proof text thing. But I don't think that that'd be the right way to do it. I mean, if you look at all of Scripture in context, earthly things are not bad. As we live on this earth, we have to have food, we have to have water. But at the end of the day, we have to remember, what money is. It's a tool to exchange goods and services. But it's God who at the end of the day gives us our daily bread. So I think that if you are going to try to say that Christians should not pursue wealth, that Christians should not pursue making money, and that we should not pursue good things on this earth, then I think just cherry picking this one Bible verse and then blowing it up out of context, I don't think that's going to be enough to make your case. I think at some point you are going to have to be the one to prove that money is bad, or that the pursuit of money is bad, given the rest of Scripture, given the fact that Jesus compared the kingdom of heaven to a capitalist endeavor, and given the fact that making money is generally a positive, throughout the Bible, as long as money is not being put into the place of God.
Yes. Now, remember how Francisco pointed out that some people would sell their soul for 5 cents. Now, compare this to the prioritization principle that Jesus gives. So if we go to Matthew 6:24, no one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. So if we take Jesus for what he's saying there, it's a matter of priorities. Do you care about moral principles, and do you care about pleasing your Lord? Or do you care about more money? Whenever you're in a situation where you believe that you're going to have to say yes to one and no to the other, which one do you prioritize? That's the issue. This is completely compatible with rational self-interest. Now, another point of comparison is if seeking money was really so bad, and I love the way you brought in Proverbs 31, and the entire book of Proverbs is a practical life on earth book. But if you think about what money is for in the Bible, you'll realize that it actually is for prosperity and for meeting the needs of people. Look in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 1 through 4. Paul writes, "Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so you also are to do. On the first day of each week, each of you is to put aside something, store it up, as he may prosper, so that there will be no collecting when I come. And when I arrive, I will send those whom you accredit by letter to carry your gift to Jerusalem. If it seems advisable that I should go also, they will accompany me." Jerusalem had a problem for reasons that we could get into. The Christians in Jerusalem were in poverty, I think partly due to persecution, possibly in part due to the fact that they had sold their land, thinking that the return of Christ was so close. They had sold their land, and so they were not in a financial good position. But here is Paul encouraging collections of money. So would Paul say that what he's doing is evil? Of course he wouldn't. And he says to store it up as you may prosper. So the prosperity has a purpose. Prosperity is good, and it has a good purpose. What we're looking at is there is an integration between the money and the purpose for that money. That is a rational approach to money. Well, let's go back to look at the irrational approach to money. This is in page 92. Francisco is describing, I think, the United States of America in 1957, but way more in 2022. As you know from your understanding of history, there was the Bretton Woods Agreement where the United States and England, I don't know all the details, but eventually they got off the gold standard. And By the 1970s, Nixon had taken the United States completely off the gold standard. But Rand was already familiar that this was happening in 1957. And look at how she describes this trend. Do you wish to know whether that day is coming? Watch money. Money is the barometer of a society's virtue. When you see that trading is done not by consent but by compulsion, when you see that in order to produce you need to obtain permission from men who produce nothing, when you see that money is flowing to those who deal not in goods but in favors, when you see that men get richer by graft and by poll and by work, and your laws don't protect you against them but protect them against you, when you see corruption being rewarded and honesty becoming self-sacrifice, you may know that your society is doomed. He goes on, money is so noble a medium that it does not compete with guns and it does not make terms with brutality. It will not permit a country to survive as half property, half loot. Whenever destroyers appear among men, they start by destroying money. And isn't that the truth? If you look at the history of the Roman Empire, the way they debased the currency, that is exactly what happened in Germany later, right before World War II. It's what happened in England. It's what happens in the United States lately. Destroyers seize gold and they leave to its owners a counterfeit pile of paper. Gold was an objective value, an equivalent of wealth produced. Paper is a mortgage on wealth that does not exist, backed by a gun aimed at those who are expected to produce it. Let's unpack that sentence. The United States has the ability to back up its currency by force of guns and by force of taxes. And the United States is able to go into trillions of dollars worth of debt by pointing guns at my children who are still only 8 years old and 6 years old and saying, by the time you get to be an adult, we're going to give you a social security number, you're going to be paying part of your salary into this system. And the United States can go into great debt now by printing money that stands for no wealth that currently exists, on the assumption that eventually Ira and Dagny are going to create that wealth. So it is a mortgage on wealth that does not exist, backed by a gun aimed at those who are expected to produce it. Francisco goes on, when you have made evil the means of survival, do not expect men to remain good. Do not expect them to produce when production is punished and loot is rewarded. Do not ask who is destroying the world. You are. Let me move forward. About a paragraph down, he says, through all the centuries of stagnation and starvation, men exalted the looters as aristocrats of the sword. But then came the Industrial Revolution. Then came capitalism. To the glory of mankind, says Francisco, there was for the first and only time in history a country of money. And I have no higher, more reverent tribute to pay America. For this means a country of reason, justice, freedom, production, achievement. Man's mind and man's money were set free. And there were no fortunes by conquest, only fortunes by work. This is a broad brush, but for the most part, that is true. And you can look at the industrialists and you can ask yourself, how did they become wealthy? Some of them, say the California railroad tycoons, they used pull. They cheated. But for the most part, wealth in the United States in the 1800s was developed by work. The glaring exception being slavery, where a very small group of people in the American South were able to enrich themselves by slavery. But they were not able even to compete with the industrial North. Going on, men had always thought of wealth as a static quantity to be seized, bagged, inherited, shared, looted, or obtained as a favor. I think that's a small bit of hyperbole because there were people before the United States of America that thought correctly about money. But on the whole, it is a correct generalization that is how people thought about money. Americans were the first to understand that wealth has to be created. The words to make money hold the essence of human morality. I think that America on the whole was the first society on the whole to understand this. So as a generalization, I agree. Now, I'll wrap up the speech. He says, until and unless you discover that money is the root of all good, you ask for your own destruction. When money ceases to be the tool by which men deal with one another, then men become the tools of men. Blood, whips, and guns, or dollars, take your choice. There is no other, and your time is running out. Well, he just made a very strong claim there, saying that money is the root of all good. I think you have to take this as a poetic expression. Perhaps there's some license there, because I don't think, strictly speaking, that money is the root of all good, but that it is connected to productivity and virtue and rationality, which are the roots of human good. Any interactions with that?
Sure, I'm reminded of a scene, I think it involves Reardon and Dagny when they are together in a relationship. And there's a scene that if I could find it, I would read it and quote it. But I remember they go out to all sorts of fancy places, like fancy restaurants, ballrooms together. They spend a lot of their money that they've made together. And they say to each other, and they think to themselves, all the people here who are enjoying these things feel empty because they think that these fancy things, these luxuries, are themselves supposed to provide them with a sense of satisfaction. Whereas we actually get satisfaction from them because we understand where they came from. We appreciate the work that we did to be able to spend that money on these luxuries. Dagny and Reardon talk about that, and I always that scene always stood out to me, because in a lot of situations, Rand's characters are sort of at the bottom, whether it's Rourke in the mines or Galt, working in the railroad station, but it's nice to see them enjoy themselves a little bit right there in that scene.
Well, that finishes up the first of the speeches, and that is the longest of them. We'll have shorter discussion on the next three, so we actually have three more to cover. We'll go fairly quick. So they are the martyrdom of the industrialists, and then the next one would be the courtroom speech of Reardon, and then finally the meaning of sex. So these are one by Francisco, one by Reardon, and one more by Francisco. Martyrdom of the industrialists. This is Francisco speaking. He's talking to Reardon, and he says, "To what have you submitted at the hands of men? You who know from your work that one bears punishment only for being wrong. What have you been willing to bear, and for what reason? All your life you have heard yourself denounced, not for your faults, but for your greatest virtues." And skipping about a paragraph down, he says, "You have been sneered at as a vulgar materialist. By what right? By what code? You knew what exacting morality was needed to produce a single metal nail, but you let them brand you as immoral. You knew that man needs the strictest code of values to deal with nature, but you thought that you needed no such code to deal with men. You left the deadliest weapon in the hands of your enemies, a weapon you never suspected or understood. Their moral code is their weapon." And this is a big part of the plot of Atlas Shrugged, is Henry Reardon, learning all these things. Ask yourself how deeply and in how many terrible ways you have accepted it. Ask yourself what it is that a code of moral values does to a man's life, and why he can't exist without it, and what happens to him if he accepts the wrong standard, by which the evil is the good. Well, I think this is a good place to pause. Let's ask ourselves that exact question. Kind of a complicated question, but he says, what does a moral code do to a man's life? And why can you not exist without it? Thoughts on that? How would you summarize that?
I think that what a lot of us grew up with is, we're just given a lot of do's and don'ts, by our teachers, by our parents, like, don't do that. Why? Because that's bad. And I think it's easy to grow up and kind of have this idea that, there's things that are good and there's things that are bad. And even as adults, maybe not always ask why and really process through these things and say, what is good, what is evil? And of course, I think that brings us to this question.
We always are operating on some motivation, some concept of what should be pursued. The moral code tells you how to approach that question. What is worth pursuing? Everybody is driven by their moral code. In some way, at some point. So what does a moral code of values do to a man's life? Why can't he exist without it? Well, the moment that you had no code, that would mean that you have no vision for where you're going, which would mean you'd have no motivation, which would mean you'd stop moving. You would stop acting. And then ask what happens to him if you accept the wrong standard. Well, then that will drive the ship. The ship will go in the wrong direction. You have to have a moral code, and So here, in the context of the story, Francisco is critiquing Reardon. And he's saying, your code took you to these good destinations, but it's also taking you to these bad destinations. So let's evaluate. Let's go to the next page. He says, the worst guilt is to accept an undeserved guilt. I'm not sure what he means in the sense of the worst guilt, because if you look just a couple lines later, he says, man's motive power is his moral code. A viler evil than to murder a man is to sell him suicide as an act of virtue. So the vilest thing is these people like Ellsworth Toohey that go around preaching self-sacrifice. That's vile. Morally vile and wicked. Whereas I think that if you look at what he's saying about Hank Reardon, the worst guilt is to accept an undeserved guilt. I think maybe it's the worst in a different sense here. Like the most sad, pathetic guilt. Skipping several paragraphs, he says, consider the obscenity of offering their impotence and their need of you as a justification for your torture. Are you willing to accept it? And we get again to this theme that we always see in Rand, which is that need does not constitute a claim on others. Now we get the passage where Rand got the title Atlas Shrugged. Francisco says, if you saw Atlas, the giant who holds the world on his shoulders, if you saw that he stood, blood running down his chest, his knees buckling, his arms trembling, but still trying to hold the world aloft with the last of his strength, and the greater his effort, the heavier the world bore down upon his shoulders, what would you tell him to do? I don't know. What could he do? What would you tell him? To shrug. Francisco's famous line is, check your premises. And this is a matter of reframing, lateral thinking skills. Do you guys ever look at those lateral thinking puzzles? You know, like where somebody rides the elevator down every morning from the 50th floor, but every afternoon when he goes back up to the 50th floor where he lives, he only rides it up halfway and then he has to walk. Except for on rainy days. On rainy days, he's able to go straight up to the top again. You ever heard this puzzle? Well, the explanation is that he's a very, very short man. He's a dwarf. And so he cannot reach the 50th button. But on rainy days, he has his umbrella, so he takes his umbrella and goes, poke! Two soldiers facing opposite directions in a field. And one of them says to the other, why are you smiling? How did you know that you were smiling? How did you know? If they're facing opposite directions, how does one soldier know?
Well, easy. They're looking at each other.
Greg, you'd be outstanding at the lateral thinking puzzles challenge. But Francisco does this reframing where you check your premises. You know, your premise was that the soldiers had to be facing one north and one south, and they were facing away from each other. But the point is, these lateral thinking puzzles, Francisco would be a genius at this because he's willing to step outside, question his premises. And he always says, if you find that you have a contradiction, check your premises because one of them is wrong. Well, apply that mindset to this question of how would Atlas handle it when he's carrying the whole world and the whole world hates him. Well, why were you holding the world in the first place? Do you need to? Greg, I remember you told me that this was quite a realization for you a while back. If you had anything you wanted to share personally about that, I'd love to hear it on the video today.
I mean, I think there was a point in my life where I felt like the whole world was on my shoulders. I felt like it was my responsibility to solve poverty. And, you know, why I would think that in the first place, I don't know. Maybe it's, you know, just the way we're raised in both the education system and in today's churches.
Well, holding the weight of the world on your shoulders was what I was thinking. And you told me that there was a time when you thought that that was true and you realized, hey, I have to prioritize these other things. So you have your career, you're thinking of your education, and then you have some projects, content creating and things that are intended to help other people and be in ministry. And you just realized that ministry is not the only thing that you need to be thinking about right now. And you don't need, when somebody gets in your face on the internet and critiques your view, you don't need to spend an hour interacting with them. This approach that says, I own my life, I have certain responsibilities, and the weight of the world is not on my shoulders, that is something that we have to go through as we mature as Christians.
I used to argue with people a lot online in the comments section until one day I had a friend who said, you know, Greg, you're a content creator, you know, go create content. Now, I do think right now I probably spend more time sharing stuff on Facebook than actually creating content. At least it feels that way. But Jesus said, do not throw your pearls before pigs. And I've got an article I'm working on now, should be out soon. It's something to the effect of disagreement versus wickedness. And you're going to have people who just want to argue with you. I have, some relatives who I literally asked them one time, can we at least agree that the grass is green? And they wanted to argue with me about it. And I've probably actually mentioned that story on video before, so I won't go into too much detail here. But the bottom line is you're going to have people who just want to argue. And Jesus said, if you go to a town or village and you're bringing the gospel and they reject your message, shake the dust off of your feet, leave that town or village, and go on to the next one. So you're going to, in this world, have it where there are people who hate truth, whereas people who are not ready to hear it. And I know there's been times in my life where I've not been necessarily ready to hear every truth. And people aren't always going to be ready. So some people, they just hate truth. Other people aren't going to be ready. And you can't take it personally. You have to just keep going. Yeah. Had I met you 2 years before we actually met each other, I probably wouldn't have been ready to receive the message of, Christian egoism and things like that. I think I had to read Thomas Sowell first before I was ready to understand these ideas. So at the end of the day, it's like, have grace. I think everybody has to have grace for people and understand that, not everybody's going to be ready all the time, and you don't have to spend all your time arguing with somebody. And sometimes they're not ready. Sometimes they are from Satan to waste your time. And, that's the way it is. Obey God, keep going, because there is going to be soft ground out there that is ready to hear that seed.
Thank you for pointing all that out. I noticed that principle of going to try to sow the seeds of the gospel and of other truths, places where it will be received, that principle is difficult to understand unless you understand the value-oriented, personal interest approach that we always are talking about here.
I almost forgot to mention, because you had said, hey, you have other things going on in your life. In my case in life, hey, I've got a career to go for. I'm still looking for Miss Right. And I would like to get into better shape. I don't want to be 20 years from now single, overweight, arguing with people on the internet, who just don't want to listen. At some point, I have to steward my own life and focus on taking care of my life first. And it does, talk about this in the Bible, taking care of your own household first before going into ministry. And, before you can take care of your own household, you got to take care of yourself. So, and I think that can be a strong witness and a strong ministry of being a man, doing what a man is supposed to do in his life, and just even being that example by shepherding your own life. That can be a witness to other people. That could be a witness to the woke who says, who's going and chasing after cheap sex and chasing after, cheap thrills. Those woke people who want to just have a potato chip life and think that there's no consequences, they're going to look at the person who is married, who has children, who is happy, who has a career, and they're going to be jealous of that person and convicted by that person, and that might make them say, hey, what am I doing? I was sold a bill of good by the feminists and by the narcissists. Maybe I need to rethink what I'm doing with my life and start doing things appropriately.
There's a related idea to the personal responsibility angle that you're describing there. So having young kids in my house was very difficult for me. Sasha and I split the care of the children fairly evenly, and if you're a man in your 30s, you don't want to be hanging out with a 1-year-old and a 2-year-old and a 3-year-old a lot of time. And I worked from the house. I did marketing work for those years and also some writing. And working while having young kids in the house can be very frustrating. And at some point, I came to this realization that the mood, the emotional atmosphere of my house was going to depend on my attitude and how much patience I had for the kids. And I realized I've got to get myself to the point where I love being with these kids. And that took some time. I had to think about it and realize, well, first of all, I need some space from the kids. I need to arrange to have some space from them. Because when I'm with them most of the day, even just in the same house with them most of the day, even if they're in the other room playing, my patience starts wearing thin because I just hear so many moments of drama and meltdowns and things like that. And so what I realized is I need time out of the house, away from these guys, so that when I come back in, I'll be happy to see them. And I need that. And they need that. They don't just need me to care for them. They need me to love being with them and to light up in my face. And so that was hard for me because I had these aspirations of building a career. And I had to say, what is more important for what I can do in the world right now to make the world a better place is to be a better dad. To be a happier dad will help me be a better dad. And so many times pastors lay a guilt load on their people and they say, you know what? It's not really about you being happy. It's not really about you being well-fed and content and comfortable. It's about us building my church. So donate more. And I'm thinking, maybe not. Maybe a higher value is that I be a better dad to my kids. And part of that is that I have a wise work-life balance. And maybe I'm not donating quite as much money as you would want me to build your church. I know that seems really radical, but if you look at the value that's being created by the church versus the value that's being created in your family, we're creating people. And the church is doing its part in raising those people in fearing God. But we have to think about those two things about how they fit together and not sacrifice one to the other. All right, now let's go to the next section here. On page 97, the moral meaning of capitalism. So this is Hank Reardon in a trial, another one of these big trial situations where someone gets to declare to the world what their values are. And I love this. So, Reardon is on trial for the illegal sale of a metal alloy which he had created and which had been placed under control by government rationing. And so here's what he says. I do not want my attitude to be misunderstood. I shall be glad to state it for the record. I work for nothing but my own profit, which I make by selling a product they need to men who are willing and able to buy it. I do not sacrifice my interest to them, nor do they sacrifice theirs to me. We deal as equals by mutual consent to mutual advantage. I have made my money by my own effort, in free exchange, and through the voluntary consent of every man I dealt with. Skipping ahead, he says, do I wish to pay my workers more than their services are worth to me? I do not. Do I wish to sell my product for less than my customers are willing to pay me? I do not. Do I wish to sell it at a loss or give it away? I do not. He says, I refuse to accept as guilt the fact of my own existence and the fact that I must work in order to support it. I refuse to accept as guilt the fact that I am able to do it and to do it well. We're on 98 now. He says, I could say to you that I have done more good for my fellow man than you can ever hope to accomplish, but I will not say it because I do not seek the good of others as a sanction for my right to exist, nor do I recognize the good of others as a justification for their seizure of my property or their destruction of my life. I will not say that the good of others was the purpose of my work. My own good was my purpose, and I despise the man who surrenders his. I could say to you that you do not serve the public good, that nobody's good can be achieved at the price of human sacrifices, and when you violate the rights of one man, you have violated the rights of all, and a public of rightless creatures is doomed to destruction. I could say to you that you will and can achieve nothing but universal devastation, as any looter must, when he runs out of victims. I could say it, but I won't. It's not your particular policy that I challenge, but your moral premise. If it were true that men could achieve their good by means of turning some men into sacrificial animals, and I were asked to immolate myself for the sake of creatures who wanted to survive at the price of my blood, if I were asked to serve the interests of society apart from, above, and against my own, I would refuse. I would reject it as the most contemptible evil. I would fight it with every power I possess. I would fight the whole of mankind if 1 minute were all I could last before I were murdered. I would fight it in the full confidence of the justice of my battle and of a living being's right to exist. Let there be no misunderstanding about me if it is now the belief of my fellow men who call themselves the public that their good requires victims. Then I say, the public good be damned. I will have no part of it. Any interactions on Hank Reardon's speech there?
We talk about the moral meaning of capitalism. It kind of goes back to what you were the reference you made earlier with American slavery. There's people these days who want to say, well, the wealth of America was built on slavery. But as you pointed out, it was those parts of the country, that had abolished slavery that were the most prosperous. And it's been pointed out by economists, including Thomas Sowell, that much of what you saw in the South with a lot of the backwardsness and a lot of the aggressive laziness in the Southern culture.
Aggressive laziness. That's a great term.
It's if you read his book, Black Rednecks and White Liberals, or maybe it was the other way around. It was really eye-opening, and what you saw in the South was this attitude where the Anglo-Saxons who lived in the South, they wouldn't even build a bridge, to cross, a river, and that was here sometimes and not others. But the Germans who lived in the South, they would build a bridge. If they saw a stump in their field, they would pull it out. So you saw this huge difference in the work ethic between the Anglo-Saxons in the South versus, the Germans. And a lot of this had to do with slavery. Not, that Germans never had slaves. I'm not sure how all that worked. But in the North and in New England, that was predominantly Anglo-Saxons also. But they didn't have slavery, and they had much stronger biblical values, especially in New England. So basically what you saw in New England and in the North, you saw a lot of freedom, a lot of economic freedom. You saw more in terms of capitalism, and that's where you saw a lot of the prosperity, whereas in the South you saw slavery. And so some people try to say, well, America built its wealth on slavery. No. That just doesn't line up with the facts of history, especially because most of our wealth came after the Civil War. And people try to blame slavery on capitalism, and I've got a whole article on that, but if capitalism is economic freedom where the rights of the individual are respected, then slavery is the exact opposite. So take that for what it is.
I would say that if you read the speech and your reaction to it is, I hate Hank Rearden, then I could tell you, I could tell that you're a second-hander. I could tell that you're a leech. I could tell you what your view of money is. It's important to understand who Hank Rearden is talking to, and obviously you need to go to the context of this speech for that, or this part of, what he says. But these people are either politicians or they're in government. They're government workers, and they essentially steal. That's how they make their living. They don't earn, really, the money that they make. And they disguise their work under the guise of the social good. We do what we do because it's good for society. And Hank Rearden is calling them out for their farce. They are not doing what they're doing for the social good, but for their own benefit. Hank Rearden is just honest, but he's more than honest about his own self-interest. He actually earned the money he made. Whereas these men aren't just lying about their own self-interest. They haven't earned a dime. The reason why you, person out there who may have reacted to Hank Rearden's speech and say, I hate Hank Rearden, the reason for that is because you think money can't be earned, or you're living your life in such a way where you think the only way to get money is to steal, is to be a second-hander, is to be a leech on the work of other people. So when you see someone with a lot of money, you automatically assume they must have stolen it. They must have leveraged power somehow to take it from others. That is not the case for Hank Rearden. He earned his money not by violating other people's rights, but by living as a free man and providing value to society.
I noticed that there is a connection logically between all of the things that Francisco said to Reardon and the things that Reardon says here. And I think that is quite helpful to realize that he had to come to these realizations before he could stand up for himself and take the moral high ground on these issues. This idea that people would, like you said, be leeches or mooches, and that they would steal, or that they would not know where money comes from, and that therefore they would disvalue it, that was all contained within Francisco's. Well, here we have Reardon learning that his productivity is valuable. In the next section, we're going to hear another discussion between Francisco and Reardon. This will be Francisco now pushing his point even further. Okay, Reardon, you've now understood the moral basis for your productivity. Now let's look at the moral basis for your approach to your love life. So, the meaning of sex is the next section here. Francisco, and by the way, they are both in love with the same woman at this point, but they don't know it. And Francisco is just sharing his overall worldview, his thoughts with Reardon. The man who despises himself tries to gain self-esteem from sexual adventures which can't be done, because sex is not the cause but an effect, and an expression of a man's sense of his own value. Similar to the way money is an effect. And similarly, people try to fake the cause, they try to fake human value by just putting the effect in place, but doing it promiscuously. They think that your body creates a desire and makes a choice for you. Love is blind, they say. Sex is impervious to reason and mocks the power of all philosophers. But in fact, a man's sexual choice is the result of and the sum of his fundamental convictions. Tell me what a man finds sexually attractive, and I will tell you his entire philosophy of life. Show me the woman he sleeps with, and I will tell you his valuation of himself. And he goes on, sex is the most profoundly selfish of all acts, an act which he cannot perform for any motive but his own enjoyment. Just try to think of performing it in a spirit of selfless charity. An act which is not possible in self-abasement, only in self-exaltation, only in the confidence of being desired and being worthy of desire. And this explains why those in the past who have tried to downplay the value of man's life on earth have often downplayed money and sex. It is an act that forces him to stand naked in spirit as well as in body and to accept his real ego as his standard of value. He will always be attracted to the woman who reflects his deepest vision of himself, the woman whose surrender permits him to experience or to fake a sense of self-esteem. The man who is proudly certain of his own value will want the highest type of woman he can find. Skipping ahead, he does not seek to gain his value, he seeks to express it. There is no conflict between the standards of his mind and the desires of his body. But compare that to a man with low standards. Francisco says, but the man who is convinced of his own worthlessness will be drawn to a woman he despises because she will reflect his own secret self. She will release him from that objective reality in which he is a fraud. On page 100, observe the ugly mess which most men make of their sex lives, and observe the mess of contradictions which they hold as their moral philosophy. One proceeds from the other. Love is our response to our highest values and can be nothing else. Let man corrupt his values and his view of existence. Let him profess that love is not self-enjoyment but self-denial, that virtue consists not of pride but of pity or pain or weakness or sacrifice, that the noblest love is born not of admiration but of charity, not in response to values but in response to flaws. And he will have cut himself in two. And of course the consequence when people cut themselves in two is that they go seeking promiscuous relationships, and he's going to get into that. He has equated virtue with pain, and he will feel that vice is the only realm of pleasure. So he's twisted it in his mind. He thinks vice, pleasure, these are the same thing. Then he will wonder why love brings him nothing but boredom and sex nothing but shame. He goes on and he kind of brings it home to who Hank Reardon is as a man. You're the man who's spent his life shaping matter to the purpose of his mind. You're the man who would know that just as an idea unexpressed in physical action is contemptible hypocrisy, so is platonic love. And just as physical action unguided by an idea is a fool's self-fraud, so is sex when cut off from one's code of values. You would be incapable of a desire for a woman you despised. Only the man who extols the purity of a love devoid of desire is capable of the depravity of a desire devoid of love. Now, On the next page, in the middle of the page, he talks about the man who spends his time chasing women. And he says that such a man would try going through the motions of the effect to acquire that which should have been the cause. He tries to gain a sense of his own value from the women who surrender to him. And he forgets that the women he picks have neither character nor judgment nor standard of value. He tells himself that all he's after is physical pleasure, but observe that he tires of his women in a week or a night. It is the feeling of achievement that he seeks, but never finds. What glory can there be in the conquest of a mindless body? So this touches on the current discussions online that you see with these guys that are giving all this advice on how to date lots and lots of women and how to have sex with lots of different people. This connects with the trend in our society today that many people are looking at pornography and that they are disconnecting their personal values from their enjoyment of sexual activity. And so you can see Ayn Rand's view, although she is not a Christian, is a lot more Christian than the attitudes and behavior of many pastors and many Christians today, especially the progressive ones, but even among conservative pastors, the prevalence of secret use of pornography or committing adultery or different things like this, it strikes us that there is a disconnect. And Francisco has named it here. He's pointed out that it's our moral code, this separating of value from love, that causes this problem. If you separate love from value, well then eventually you're going to start treating the things that are appropriate to love, like sexual activity. You're going to start treating those as if they are vices. And then value will be for the woman that you married, and pleasure will be for some other woman. That's the divide in man's heart. I think this is a powerful integration here philosophically. Ayn Rand does not have a lot to say philosophically about sex, but what she does say about it is that it is good. And what we can know from general revelation is that the biblical sexual ethic is correct. It's for marriage. It's for marriage between a man and a woman. And we don't see that played out consistently in Ayn Rand's work. She has people having sex before marriage. But she ought to have known. And in her personal life, she ought to have known. And so the things that she did, she violated general revelation in the things that she advocated. But we as Christians can look at the point that Francisco is making here and say, he's right, psychologically, about the importance of connecting life on earth, rationality, personal interest to productivity and to sex. Those are the things in life that men should seek, productivity and a romantic relationship. These would be some of your highest values that you could obtain. In our society today, we see such a confusion on both of those. And the reason is philosophical, which means that to get out, we're going to need to have this kind of philosophical approach that we see in this book. Interactions before we go to our closing section.
Realizing the connection between the talk about money and the talk about sex, and I'll take a crack at it. There was so much in what you just read, Cody, and so much there that Christian men need to first read and then think about for 5 minutes and think about even more for longer than that, because there's a lot there about self-respect. And on the concept of self-respect, there was that quote, "The man who hates money will sell his soul for a nickel." And I understood that as my way of understanding that was he hates money because he resents it for his false belief that he needed to sell his soul to get that nickel, whereas he simply could have just earned it. He just could have done the work to earn a nickel, but he had these false beliefs about money and now resents it because he sold his soul for a nickel. When it comes to sex, like the talks about cheap, whores and just having sex with whores, and you've removed the self-respect. Like, even the person who sells their soul for a nickel, they should have even just thought, wait, my soul is worth more than that. Even if I need this nickel, why would I sell my soul for a nickel? I can't do that. Even if I think that's the only way to get a nickel, I should have the self-respect to know that I can't do that. I simply can't do that. I couldn't live with myself if I did that. Similarly, when you think about sex, like, people have these false beliefs about it, and they turn to cheap sex because they don't have self-respect. They haven't tied their personal values to sex, and they're willing to, essentially be just like the whore and sell themselves out to a false and shallow version of sex.
I think this is a big place where the objectivists have gone wrong. They want to push their atheism, and their arguments for atheism are some of the worst that I've ever seen. And it's amazing because they'll have these amazing arguments for logic, and it's some of the strongest philosophy, strongest logic I've ever read. But then when it comes to their arguments against God, it's even worse than the things that Richard Dawkins puts forth. And I think a lot of that, might have to do with this shame that, they understand that they have this high view of sex, yet they want to try to divorce that from marriage. No pun intended. And I think it's a real shame that that's. I really think that that's the thing that is causing a lot of harm to the objectivist movement. And I think those, the atheism and their views of sex outside of marriage, trying to justify that, I think those two are connected.
I appreciated what you were saying about connecting the objectivist errors on whether God exists to their other errors, such as whether you should follow a conventional sexual ethic, one man, one woman marriage, those kinds of things. And I think that there is, if I were to say what are the main areas where I disagree with the objectivists, it would be whether God exists, and whether he deserves for us to praise him, and whether he is the judge of the earth, who will send us to hell if we disobey what he has revealed about right and wrong. All of that. And then that has an application to the realm of sex, where the objectivists today, although Ayn Rand was anti-homosexuality, Leonard Peikoff was, and then he switched as sort of the culture shift happened. And so the objectivists today are pro-homosexuality for the most part. And they don't have anything to say against people having premarital sex or something like that, or divorce. Clearly, if you look at the objectivists, the way they've lived their own lives, divorce is frequent. So they have no fear of God. You know how in the Proverbs it says that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom? The kind of knowledge and wisdom that we're talking about there is how to live your life. And the objectivists clearly don't have that. They don't have that when it comes to their sexual ethics. And they also don't have it when it comes to abortion, which is an implication of sexual ethics to some degree. So I'd say those are the three huge errors, is their treatment of God, their treatment of sex, and their treatment of abortion. On those areas, their lives are a mess. Worse than even Francisco was describing in this story. So the solution there would be for them to take general revelation seriously. God has revealed himself through his creation, that there is a creator that he will judge, and that he has moral claims on us. And those moral claims include that we behave rightly on important matters, productivity and sex. So that's some of my interaction, just my trying to create an integrated understanding of these issues and how Christianity ought to be pushing the objectivists on these issues. I agree with you, Greg, that the arguments from the objectivists on atheism and on sex and on abortion, they are all just so weak. Shockingly so. We should call them to their own standards, because they can name the standards of objectivity. All right, well, I will wrap up our video for this week. The next couple of weeks in the new intellectual book study, we're going to be branching out from what was a focus on personal ethics and on the motivations of a heroic man. And we're going to be looking at how these ideas affect human history, how they affect society. So in the coming week, which will be our fourth week looking at these speeches, we're going to be looking at the later Atlas Shrugged speeches, which will include one of the long speeches describing this tragedy that happened in Starnesville, the 20th century motor company disaster. This will be a look at Marxism, but applied to a microcosm of one town. What happens if one town takes Marxism seriously? So I hope that you'll join us for that one. And then after that, we're going to move on even to some of the later speeches. And finally, eventually in the next year, I think we'll look at John Galt's speech, and probably take 5 weeks to look at John Galt's speech because it's fairly long. Through this process, FTNCI, ChristianIntellectual.com, is figuring out what it is that is in Ayn Rand's work that is worth plundering. We're taking the gold and the treasure and the plunder of the Egyptians. I hope that you'll join us for that process. You can go to ChristianIntellectual.com/subscribe to get on our email updates, /intellectual to get the page to register for this and to get access to all these videos, and also to /Patreon if you believe in the project and you want to support it. I would call on you to think about the need for there to be an intellectual army. How are we going to get there? This is my answer to that question. Thank you for joining today, and God bless, and I will talk to you soon.